This is the story of Singapore Airlines Flight 006. It was the 31st of October 2000 on the island of Taiwan. It was a dark and windy night. Flight 006 was hoping to get airborne as soon as possible as a typhoon was bearing down on the island. The pilots had been flying the plane since the day before. They had been all over the world, from Singapore to Los Angeles and to Taipei. At 9:53 p.m. that night, the pilots completed their pre-flight briefings and picked up the NOTAMS, or Notice to Airmen, for the night. It contained important information that someone flying there should know. At 10:57 p.m., the pilots got clearance from ATIS. The ATIS transmission could be heard in the background, telling them that the departure runway was 5 left. Wind was at 020 at 36 knots, gusting to 52 knots, and visibility was 450 meters or 1,500 feet. The rain beat down on the airport, marking the arrival of the typhoon. The captain was the one flying, and at 11:05 p.m. the pilots got permission to taxi, and they were given their taxi clearance. Singapore 6 taxi to runway 06 via taxiway, runway 05 left via taxiway Sierra Sierra, West Cross, and November Papa. The co-pilot said, "I missed that, man. What is it?" The captain repeated the clearance for him. After this, the crew engaged in chatter about how they'd get to runway 5 left. They also talked about alternate airports because Hong Kong and Kai-Shek were closed. As they taxied, the captain said, "A lot of rudder work here. I'm going to go very slow here because you're going to get into skid." The plane was on the ground and the wind was so strong that the pilots had a bit of trouble with the wind. As they taxied onto taxiway November Papa, they were transferred over to the tower. Singapore 6, good evening. Taipei Tower holds short runway 5 left. The first officer acknowledged. The first officer said, "Next one is November 1, referring to the taxiway that they had to get on to get to runway 5 left. "Okay, second right," the captain responded. The first officer agreed. As they got near to the runway threshold, the tower gave them the all clear. Singapore 6, runway 05 left, wind 020, at 28, gust to 50, cleared for takeoff. At 11:15 p.m., the crew were done with the takeoff checklist, and they made the right turn onto the runway. They were very careful as the rain had made everything really slippery. With them on the runway, the first officer said that the PVD, or the para-visual display, hadn't lined up yet. To which the captain replied, "Yeah, we gotta line up first." But even when they had lined up, the PVD was not aligned. The captain said that they could see the runway, and so that wasn't that big of an issue. At 11:16 and 44 seconds, they started their takeoff roll. The first officer called out, 80 knots. The captain said, "Something's there," which was followed by the first sounds of impact. Flight 006 had collided with construction equipment. They had not taken off from runway 5 left. The right landing gear slammed into some construction equipment. The left landing gear went over a pit on the runway, which blew a few tires. The plane then headed straight into an excavator, damaging the lower left side of the plane. The stabilizer was hit by debris, and it failed. There was a bit of rebar on the left side of the runway, and engine number 1 struck that. The plane now started to yaw to the left. The plane then hit 2 steamrollers and broke into 2. The right wing was sheared off. The plane hit the equipment 4,000 feet from the runway threshold. The plane broke in 2 and it skidded along the runway, spewing broken bits of debris everywhere. Unfortunately, of the 179 people on board, only 96 people made it. This is to date the only incident for Singapore Airlines, which resulted in fatalities. So how did a plane take off from the wrong runway? This is how they were supposed to taxi, but instead they made the right turn too early and they ended up on runway 5 right instead of 5 left. The first thing that they looked at were the taxiway lights. The lights were not up to standard. Lighting was found to be deficient where the taxiway merged with the runway. These places needed special lighting systems, which ICAO standards mandated but were not implemented at the airport. But that doesn't explain the incident. The investigators needed to know how the runways were lit up. White edge lights were used to designate runways, and other colors are used for taxiways. At the time of the accident, runway 5 right was being used only for taxiing. And so if the white edge lights were on, it could have confused the crew. They would have taxied up to the runway, and seeing the white lights, they may have assumed that they were looking at runway 5 left. But after interviewing controllers, other pilots at the airport that day, Looking at videos of the crash and analyzing the filaments of broken edge light bulbs, they came to the conclusion that in all probability, the edge lights were not turned on. Making matters worse for the crew, the controller could not see the final portion of the crew's taxi from the tower due to poor visibility. They then looked at the crews themselves. As discussed earlier, the crew did know that runway 5 right was not available due to the work being carried out on it. This was in the NOTAM that they had got, and it was in their pre-flight briefing, but the status of 5 right in the NOTAM was not highlighted in any way. The charts that the pilots were using did show that runway 5 right was a runway, but at the time of the accident, it was used only for taxiing. But the crew were well aware that 5 right was out of commission. The captain briefed the other pilots about this. But as they dug into the actions of the crew, they found something. ATC changed their taxi route at the last moment. They now had to taxi till the end of November Papa and then cross 5 right onto runway 5 left. When taxi clearances are received, pilots make a mental map of how they should taxi. When the new clearance was given, it involved crossing runway 5 right and then turning right. But if they were in the frame of mind of the earlier taxi clearance, it would explain why they just turned onto runway 5 right. Moreover, it is possible that the crew were racing against the weather. The typhoon was closing in on Taiwan, and the weather was only going to get worse, so they wanted to take off before the weather got worse. The investigators then looked at what the crew were doing as they made that fateful right turn. The captain and the first officer were both busy with the before takeoff checklist. Moreover, the captain was concerned about keeping the plane below 5 knots so as to not slip off the runway. The third crew member in the cockpit was busy checking the crosswind component, making sure that it was safe for them to take off. With all 3 pilots engrossed with their own tasks, they lost awareness of where they were in relation to the runways. Once they lined up, the bad visibility made it so that the captain only saw the centerline lights of the runway and nothing else. In addition to this, the bad weather had caused the crew to become laser focused on the weather and not much else. But all was not lost. They still had a few ways to know that they were on the wrong runway. The paravisual display is an instrument in the periphery of the cockpit. It's an instrument that's tuned to the ILS, and it tells the pilots which way to steer if the plane isn't lined up with the runway. When they were on runway 5 right, the PVD was telling them that the runway was to their left. They then had the primary flight display. Since the ILS was tuned, it clearly showed that they were not lined up with the ILS. Like the PVD, the primary flight display would have also shown that they were offset to the right. When lined up, the diamond at the bottom of the screen is supposed to be in the center, but in the case of Singapore Flight 6, it was to the left, indicating that they were to the right of the runway. Another thing that would have alerted the crew to their mistake was the signage in and around the runway. The signs were lit up from within, and tests showed that the signs that denoted the runway and the taxiway were visible to the pilots as they turned onto runway 5 right. Another thing that played a part here was the lighting. The pilots were following the green taxiway lights in order to get to the runway. As we know, as they made that fateful turn, they were busy with their checklist. Since they weren't paying attention, they just followed the green lights that curved onto runway 5 right, but they had to go straight to get to runway 5 left. Unfortunately, the spacing between the centerline taxiway lights that led to runway 5 left may have been a reason as to why the crew believed that they were on the right runway. On the curve that led to runway 5 right, the green taxiway lights were spaced 7.5 meters apart, but the lights to the taxiway to 5 left were spaced much further apart, to the point where it didn't look like a path anymore. The correct path that they had to take was denoted by a few lonesome lights, and it did not look like a continuous path from the cockpit. At Changi Airport, where Singapore Airlines is based, ATC will turn off other paths and intersections so that the plane taxiing has one continuous green line to follow, so the pilots can easily taxi to where they want to go. But here, following the green line took them onto the wrong runway. The lights could have told the crew a lot if they would just listen. When they were on the runway, both runways were lit up in very different ways. Since runway 5 right was being used as a taxiway at the time of the accident, it had green lights going down the center to denote it as a taxiway, whereas runway 5 left was lit up like a Christmas tree. It had white edge lights, white centerline lights, touchdown zone lights, PAPI lights, etc. It was a Cat 2 ILS runway and was lit up as such. The difference from the cockpit was stark and it was noticeable. The last part of the puzzle is confirmation bias. The crew thought that they were in the right place. Right as they taxied onto runway 5 right, ATC came on and gave them the all clear. This, in the mind of the captain, was confirmation that he was where he should be. Remember, at this point, ATC could not see the plane due to the visibility. The captain's mind, from this point on, filtered out all of the things that would have alerted him to his error. And with that, they started down the runway, not knowing the dangers that the darkness hid. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. A big thank you to Starboard 76 and Speedbird HD for letting me use their amazing footage on my videos. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I'll catch you guys next time. Stay safe.